Tonight's story belongs to our Unknown series, where we explore mysteries that still remain unsolved. Few names carry as much weight in the UFO narrative as Bob Lazar and George Knapp, the whistleblower and the journalist who gave his story a voice. In the quiet stretches of the Nevada desert, whispers floated for generations. Tonight's story belongs to our Unknown series, where we explore mysteries that still remain unsolved. Few names carry as much weight in the UFO narrative as Bob Lazar and George Knapp, the whistleblower and the journalist who gave his story a voice. In the quiet stretches of the Nevada desert, whispers floated for generations. Stories of secret technology, hidden aircraft, and programs shrouded in secrecy lingered like shadows near Groom Lake. Many wrote them off as fiction. But in 1989, one man came forward with claims strong enough to pull those shadows into daylight. His name was Bob Lazar. Lazar claimed he was recruited into a covert project existing deep within the restricted airspace surrounding Area 51, a place kept from public knowledge and known only to a chosen few. What he described was no ordinary aircraft, not covert jets or experimental designs made by man. His testimony suggested something much more bizarre, machines that seemed to break the basic laws of physics. To tell such a tale took more than a storyteller. It needed someone to listen, and a platform bold enough to broadcast it. That listener was George Knapp, an investigative journalist from Las Vegas. Where others mocked or ignored the claims, Knapp chose to lean in. By airing Lazar's accounts, he associated his own identity with one of the most contentious disclosures in recent history. Together they turned murmurs into headlines and transformed an isolated strip of desert into a name recognized worldwide. Whether truth or fabrication, their accounts sparked decades of controversy, nurtured belief, drew criticism, and became one of the longest-running enigmas in UFO lore. Chapter 1: Lazar's Journey into the Unknown. The story of Bob Lazar doesn't begin in the desert, but in the restless energy of someone intrigued by speed, power, and mystery. Well before his name was linked with Area 51, an alien craft, Lazar had already built a reputation as an unconventional mind, someone who lived outside the bounds of traditional science. Born Robert Scott Lazar on January 26, 1959, he displayed the traits of a tinkerer from early childhood. Rather than theory and textbooks, he gravitated toward experimentation and hands-on curiosity. Neighbors remembered his obsession with gadgets and explosives, and as the years passed, that interest led to bold, inventive creations. For Lazar, the boundary between passion and compulsion was almost invisible. He was often seen pushing everyday machines well past their intended design, sometimes with volatile outcomes. By the early 1980s, his work was getting noticed. In Los Alamos, New Mexico, a town built around one of the world's leading scientific institutions, he stood out, not for being on the lab's payroll, but for his flair for the unusual. He famously modified a Honda Civic, outfitting it with a jet engine, a spectacle that grabbed the media's attention. Photos of Lazar in his jet-powered car made the local press, casting him as a curious blend of scientist and showman. That jet-powered Civic wasn't just a stunt, it represented Lazar's character, someone uninterested in boundaries, ready to embrace risk in pursuit of innovation. To some he was a genius unchained, to others merely a reckless eccentric. These opposing views would follow him into his future infamy. Lazar also claimed a strong academic background to support his radical ideas. He said he'd studied physics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and taken advanced studies at California Institute of Technology. He even named professors and recalled details from time spent in high-level labs. But when journalists and researchers later investigated, they uncovered nothing. No records, no diplomas, no trace. For critics, this proved he had lied. For supporters, it only reinforced the idea of a cover-up, that his past had been intentionally erased as part of a broader effort to silence him. The truth, as it often did in Lazar's life, remained hidden in the shadows. What could be confirmed was his presence in Los Alamos during the early 1980s. A directory from the Los Alamos National Laboratory listed his name, and a local newspaper featured a photograph of him beside his jet car, with a visible sign in the background linking him to the facility. Yet, officially, Los Alamos denied he was ever employed there. This contradiction marked one of the first strange inconsistencies in his story. Was he genuinely a part of the lab, or just a contractor lingering at its edge? That friction between documentation and denial became a familiar pattern throughout Lazar's life. He existed in the gray space between evidence and erasure, between being someone with privileged knowledge and someone suspected of myth-making. For many who would later challenge his claims, this blurred history became central to their skepticism. For those inclined to believe him, it only confirmed the theory that unseen forces had tried to wipe away his past. But before the world questioned his motives, Lazar was simply a relentless experimenter. He built a working particle accelerator in his home, using salvaged materials and discarded components. Friends recalled visiting and walking into his garage to find massive tubes, tangled wires, and humming devices that looked more like something from a secret lab than a suburban home. He spoke with intensity about nuclear energy, propulsion systems, and the pursuit of tapping into forces that might redefine travel. This constant drive, this hunger to explore, made Lazar difficult to place yet impossible to forget. He wasn't a man of traditional careers, he was a man of compulsive projects. Ambitious enough to turn heads, risky enough to raise eyebrows, but always fascinating enough to suggest a mind chasing something well beyond the ordinary. By the mid-1980s, Lazar had entered circles that combined cutting-edge science with government contracts. He held roles that granted him access to sensitive projects, though often on the margins. Those who knew him described him as both permitted and prevented, trusted enough to observe but never fully drawn in. It was a space that matched his nature. Lazar didn't want to be part of a system. He wanted access, insights, knowledge, and when required, he was prepared to break the silence. This was the world Bob Lazar occupied before the name S4 ever entered the public conversation. And understanding that world is essential, because it colored how people would come to react to the claims he later made. When he went public in 1989, he didn't appear in a suit and tie as a faceless whistleblower. He emerged already wrapped in contradiction, a scientist whose degrees were unverifiable, a lab technician who appeared in official directories that the lab denied, a backyard engineer who bolted jet engines onto cars. A walking paradox, hard to accept, harder to dismiss. Lazar's path to the extraordinary never followed a clean arc of accomplishment. His life was a restless clash of contradictions that mashed together fact, uncertainty, and whispered scandal. But that very contradiction became the strange credibility behind his words. He didn't polish. He didn't perform. He spoke as someone who had witnessed things that left him disturbed, and whether the world believed him or not, it couldn't easily look away. The stage had been set, his image as a brilliant outlier, combined with a controversial backstory and a brief but provable connection to one of the most secret scientific institutions in America, had created a portrait of a man poised on the edge of revelation, and the waiting would not last long. Because soon, he would assert that his obscure experiments and shadowed employment had led him into a program buried deep within the Nevada desert, a place where science, secrecy, and the supernatural all became one. And when he decided to reveal what he claimed to have seen, it wouldn't stay confined to whispers. They would reach millions, carried by the voice of a journalist willing to take the gamble. But before the glow of television lights, and before the anonymity of the name Dennis, there stood Bob Lazar, the man, the tireless experimenter, the outsider scientist. His life had always been framed by a deep sense of inquiry and the lingering haze of controversy. It was only a matter of time before those forces collided with the most guarded mystery of them all. Chapter 2. The Road to CEST 4. By the mid-1980s, Bob Lazar's journey took an abrupt and unexpected shift. His years of daring projects and ceaseless curiosity had already placed him outside the norm, but nothing in his past could have prepared him for the opportunity that would draw him toward one of America's most secretive installations. That step, the one leading to CEST 4, began without fanfare, with a simple phone call. Lazar spoke of being approached through a contractor aligned with high-level government projects. The company was EG&G, a defense and technical services firm with long-standing connections to top-secret programs. Though its name sounded ordinary within military and aerospace circles, it carried undeniable weight. This was no typical hiring process. Lazar remembered intense vetting, background investigations, probing questions, and assessments that went far beyond expertise. He faced polygraph tests, inquiries into his personal relationships, and heavy emphasis on loyalty. It was all deeply invasive, aimed at not just verifying qualifications, but judging whether he could be entrusted with truths hidden deeper than most would ever know. Once cleared, Lazar was informed he'd be working on highly classified projects. Initially, the details were sparse. All he knew was the focus, propulsion, his area of passion. That alone was reason enough to proceed. But what followed would push him far beyond the limits of known propulsion science. His entry into the world of secrets began at McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas. In a secure section of the airfield, small unmarked jets ran their routes each day. The planes bore no military markings, only a red stripe along their fuselage. Insiders had a name for them: Janet Flights. Their purpose was no secret to those who knew. They shuttled cleared personnel from Las Vegas to the location known more broadly as Area 51. Each boarding felt like entering a vacuum of silence. Tonight's story belongs to our Unknown series, where we explore mysteries that still remain unsolved. Few names carry as much weight in the UFO narrative as Bob Lazar and George Knapp, the whistleblower and the journalist who gave his story a voice. In the quiet stretches of the Nevada desert, whispers floated for generations. Lazar flew with others employed at the base, none of whom shared their roles. Conversation was minimal. Trust was cautious. From Las Vegas, the jet ascended and turned north, crossing the barren expanse below. Through the window, Lazar saw nothing but miles of desert and stone. Arrival at Groom Lake was instantly sobering. The compound was fortified, patrolled, fenced and riddled with watchful eyes. Armed guards, Idaho stations, strict protocols. It was not a place where curiosity was encouraged. Even inside, Lazar's movement was tightly controlled. Groom Lake operated like a sealed mechanism, designed for secrecy. But Groom Lake was only the beginning. Lazar soon discovered that his real assignment lay past it. South of the main base, nestled in the hills, awaited another site. This was known as CEST 4. Reaching S4 introduced yet another layer of restriction. Lazar was escorted under conditions meant to conceal. His view was deliberately obscured during transport. The route led through endless desert landscapes, then into regions where the rock itself served as camouflage. The passage wasn't just a ride through terrain, it was a descent into deeper secrecy. Upon his first arrival at CEST 4, Lazar noted how well the base vanished into its surroundings. To anyone unfamiliar, it would be invisible. The hangar doors had been cut into the hills at careful angles, sloped and tinted to mimic the surrounding stone. From above, they looked like nothing more than natural ridges of desert rock. The design was no accident. It was crafted to conceal the facility, not only from view but from detection itself. Entry into CEST 4 was governed with absolute control. From identification badges and security verification to constant escorts, every step was monitored. Even once inside, Lazar's access remained heavily limited. He was granted only the information deemed necessary, and shown only specific areas tied to his role. Compartmentalization reigned as law. Each individual held a sliver of knowledge, a single thread in a much larger tapestry. The mood within CES-4 echoed the stillness of Groom Lake, but deeper, more concentrated. Those inside moved with careful intent. Conversations were minimal, doors slid shut without delay, and every task seemed guided by unseen oversight. For Lazar, it was unlike any environment he'd experienced. No lab or workshop before had carried this atmosphere. At this point, he had not yet laid eyes on the machines that would center his story. That encounter would come later. But even in their absence, CES-4 felt profoundly unfamiliar. It seemed forged from secrecy, a place designed to house things far beyond the norm. He was presented with briefing files that hinted at the program's vast scale. Some of the documents alluded to projects and studies far outside the boundaries of traditional military tech. The text was unembellished, the implications disturbing. If the content held any truth, it pointed to a version of reality most had never imagined. Yet, as always with Lazar's narrative, doubt followed. Skeptics would later argue the papers had been staged, fabricated material intended to confuse or to test his reactions. Believers, however, saw the sheer existence of such files as proof that he had been pulled into a field of exceptional secrecy. For Lazar, the conclusion felt absolute. Whatever CES-4 contained, it wasn't mundane. It marked a turning point, from outsider scientist and fearless experimenter to one permitted glimpses inside a realm where science met the unknown. His path extended from McCarran's obscure terminal to the guarded sands of Groom Lake, and finally, into the stony silence, where CES-4 remained buried. The details Lazar provided about his recruitment, the Janet flights, layers of checkpoints, and the secretive architecture formed a major pillar of his account's credibility. It wasn't merely the fantastic claims of alien craft that drew attention. It was also the mundane yet consistent facts, procedures, defense protocols, spatial design. These details aligned closely with what others had whispered about the area and what later documentation and testimonies appeared to support. The route to CES-4 wasn't just a geographical passage through desert miles, it was entry into a hidden domain, where truth and distortion coexisted. For Lazar, it marked the moment his life changed course, a chapter that would define how history remembered him. From the moment his boot stepped past the threshold, his world tilted. Whatever questions lingered from his background, whatever uncertainties followed from his debated past, they now felt distant. He was inside, selected, screened, and placed inside a project the world wasn't meant to see. Outside, the desert kept its silence. The ridge concealed its perfectly angled entryways, and behind those doors, Lazar would soon assert, lay the artifacts that blurred myth into reality. But before that disclosure, before the awe of seeing machines that defied man's known science, came the crossing. A path forged in silences, buried truths, and a gravity felt by few. The journey to CES-4 was never chance. It was the deliberate filtering of a man whose work and reputation already hovered at the edge of science and speculation. For Lazar, it was the crossing point. For the world, it would become the birthplace of one of the most remarkable stories to emerge in the history of UFOs. Chapter 3. The Hangars of the Desert. When Bob Lazar recounted CES-4, what ignited the greatest reaction wasn't the files or the armed checkpoints. It was the moment he claimed to have stepped through the hangar doors and witnessed what lay inside. For years, speculation had shrouded the Nevada desert, strange lights in the night sky, unidentified shapes glimpsed on the horizon. But Lazar insisted this was something far beyond simple rumor. He described the facility as carved directly into the hillside, with hangars angled deceptively to blend into the rock. From the outside, CES-4 was nearly invisible, perfectly disguised against the desert's barren face. Inside, however, the illusion vanished. Harsh industrial lighting illuminated sterile environments. The hangars were quiet, meticulously organized, and clinical. It was within this environment, Lazar recalled that he laid eyes on the objects that would define his claims. Arranged along the smooth concrete floor were craft that bore no resemblance to any aircraft he'd encountered before. These were not jets, nor were they experimental models recognizable in human aviation. Lazar stated that 9 disc-shaped craft stood aligned, each slightly different in design. Their forms were sleek, unbroken, and decidedly unnatural. One, he remembered, stood with a hatch open, offering a look inside. Another had been elevated on supports, its underside revealed. Some were slightly compact, others broader and more elaborate, implying they had been retrieved from various points, or perhaps represented separate models entirely. None carried symbols, serial numbers, or visible construction marks. In Lazar's view, they didn't appear manufactured in any traditional sense. They seemed, as he described it, not made by human hands. The sight was staggering. In an instant, the tight security, the secrecy, the cryptic briefings, all coalesced into something real. This was the reason for the tightly guarded perimeter, the reason for the silence, the isolation. Lazar singled one craft out, the disc he would later label the sport model. It had a rounded dome atop a flat base, simple yet striking. Its design mirrored countless witness reports that had circulated across decades. The archetypal flying saucer, so often mocked and dismissed, seeing it in person, Lazar claimed, was both astonishing and disturbing. His account stood out because he didn't rely on vague references. He offered specifics. He spoke about measurements, surface reflections, the way light slid across the metal skin of the object. He noted the lack of bolts or seams, the appearance of a single cast structure. Sun-chin, these weren't the words of someone recycling folklore. Su, these were the observations of someone standing mere feet away. As he walked through the room, Lazar noticed that each craft varied slightly, subtle design differences, small deviations in structure. To him, it suggested that they hadn't emerged from one facility or design sheet, but had been retrieved, possibly recovered separately across different times and places. If true, this detail pointed to something enormous, that the program wasn't about studying a single vehicle, but an unknown number, all concealed and quietly examined. Lazar's reaction wasn't just awe. He admitted feeling deeply unsettled. Standing before these silent, unknowable machines inside a facility hidden from the world, he felt the magnitude of what he was seeing. This wasn't merely a breakthrough in propulsion, it was stepping into a mystery whose implications went far beyond science. One that carried a weight no one had prepared him for. The environment of the hangar only elevated that feeling. Surveillance was everywhere. Entry and exit were tracked without exception. Personnel moved with calm precision. No room for error, no tolerance for speculation. Little was spoken, and curiosity was quietly kept in check. In such a space, the presence of these discs felt all the more profound. Exotic shapes cloaked in the stark, sterile quiet of a military structure. Lazar later referred to this moment as the turning point, when any remaining doubts vanished. It confirmed, silently and undeniably, what he had been brought into. The briefings Lazar had read hinted at extraordinary technology, but witnessing the craft in person left no room for doubt. Before him stood proof that the world he thought he understood was incomplete. Critics would later suggest his description aligned too conveniently with the classic depiction of flying saucers, imagery embedded in public consciousness since the 1940s. But to supporters, this was the very point, that for decades, witnesses had been telling the truth. And here was someone describing those same objects from inside the facility where they were kept hidden. Regardless of viewpoint, the power of Lazar's story came from its detail. He didn't sound like an enthusiast or theorist. He spoke like someone recalling what he stood in front of. He didn't lean on speculation. He spoke of cold floors polished to a high sheen, of hangars lit by harsh fluorescent overheads, of discs placed side by side across clean, quiet space. He described sizes, measurements, the silence of machines seemingly in wait. One particular moment stayed with him, the sense of scale, as he walked next to a craft for the first time. He estimated its height around 15 feet, and its span roughly 50 across. It was clearly designed to transport crew, yet far shorter than any conventional aircraft. Its near-perfect symmetry gave it an organic, fluid appearance, at once simple and utterly foreign. What it meant was staggering. If these machines weren't of human origin, the implication was that the U.S. government possessed something not from Earth. If they were indeed man-made, then their design had advanced well beyond even the most elite research, and had been hidden from the vast majority of the world's engineers. Either truth was monumental. In that hangar, Lazar later said, his life was redirected. Any lingering doubts about the classified program, or questions about whether it was legitimate, were gone. The moment he saw those craft, he understood he had entered something historic, beyond anything that could be explained by traditional science. From that day, the secrecy surrounding Set 4 took on a sharper edge. Every silent stare, every badge check, every corridor he passed took on new meaning. It wasn't just a secure building, it was the barrier around the most guarded thing he had ever encountered. In time, this moment, his first sighting of 9 alien discs, would become a source of endless debate. Detractors questioned why there were no photos, why no colleagues ever publicly verified his story. Believers pointed to the consistency in his memories, the precision in his technical descriptions, and the personal jeopardy he accepted by coming forward. But in 1989, none of that noise existed. In that moment, only Lazar and the objects mattered. Smooth, silent, settled on the desert floor, they waited, patient and strange, as though unmoved by time. The hangars became something more than storage spaces. They weren't warehouses. They were chambers of revelation, vaults, where myth met material. For Lazar, stepping inside them was crossing a point of no return. From there, his story would advance, not just glimpses, but interaction. He would be brought closer, into contact with the systems that made the craft fly, into a space where the rules of physics seemed optional. That part lay ahead. For the moment, within the angled metal walls of Set 4, Bob Lazar claimed to have stood before what countless others had only imagined, the physical presence of technology far outside the reach of human creation. Chapter 4. Inside the craft. For Lazar, witnessing the discs at Set 4 was staggering, but what followed carried far greater weight. It was one thing to observe from a distance, to face machines that defied earthly origin. It was another to be told to enter, study, and eventually understand them. That became his task. Lazar explained that, like all employees at Set 4, his role was highly compartmentalized. He wasn't briefed on the program as a whole. His contact with other teams was limited. He was given a singular assignment to examine and reverse engineer the propulsion of one craft. The one he studied most closely was what he came to call the sport model. Compared to the others, it was slightly smaller, though reportedly fully intact. It sat on its landing supports with its underside exposed, allowing engineers to access key areas directly. Lazar remembered the first moment he was permitted inside. The doorway was narrow and almost invisible, seamless to the touch. When it opened, it revealed a chamber unlike anything he had ever entered. His first impression was one of smooth, unbroken design. No bolts, no rivets, no welding seams. The interior curved harmoniously, as if the entire structure had been molded from a single unified material. There were no panels, exposed wires, or anything resembling familiar human construction. The surfaces inside were consistent in both color and feel, cool, metallic, and almost organic in character. The dimensions of the space gave Lazar pause. The ceilings were low, the rooms compact. It was as if the entire craft had been scaled for beings smaller than humans. While he could move through it, the tightness of the space made it uncomfortable. Every wall and hallway felt as though it had been built for occupants not just shorter, but perhaps shaped differently than us. At the craft's core sat its most intriguing component, the reactor. This was the system he had been assigned to examine. Lazar described it as a small metallic object, smooth and solid, mounted atop a modest pedestal in the center of the ship. It gave off no sound, no heat, and no visible output, while inert. Still, it was presented as the source of the craft's capabilities, an engine that enabled movement in ways human science had never achieved. Around this core were 3 additional instruments that Lazar called gravity amplifiers. These devices were positioned in a triangular array surrounding the reactor. Each one could pivot, directing the field generated by the power source. The configuration, he explained, made up the core propulsion method. According to Lazar, the amplifiers could distort space-time itself, bending it in real time, allowing the craft to operate not by push or thrust, but by warping the environment around it. Central to this mechanism was a material that Lazar later described as element 115. At the time, it was unknown to official science. The element had yet to be synthesized anywhere. Lazar asserted that this element served as the craft's fuel, installed in select quantities within the reactor. It allegedly produced a powerful gravitational distortion when bombarded with protons. This reaction created a manipulable field, one that could be bent and vectored through the amplifiers. The idea was staggering. If true, it meant the craft had no need for propulsion as we understood it, no combustion or jet-based systems. It didn't expel matter to move. It instead altered gravity and used that to fall forward, pulling itself through space-time. The result was a machine capable of instant acceleration, sharp turns without inertia, and movement so quiet it seemed unnatural. In Lazar's words, it was a technology that rendered current propulsion systems outdated. As he explored the craft, more details added to the sense of strangeness. The floor was metal, lightly textured. The walls extended upward and curved into the ceiling gently, with no sharp edges, no joints. There were no seats like we would expect, only small backless platforms spaced as though meant for smaller frames. Nowhere did he find switches, buttons, readouts, or control pads. The cockpit, if it could be called that, was stark, minimal to an extreme degree. The systems appeared to operate with little or no direct input. Lazar admitted that much of it was well beyond what he could interpret. His background in propulsion physics gave him some framework, but this level of engineering left those ideas behind. He tried to relate what he saw to established scientific theories, but those efforts failed quickly. It was as if he were observing the end result of an unknown equation, without any exposure to the process behind it. To Lazar, the most powerful realization wasn't just that the vehicle existed, but that it had been designed. This was no meteor, no accident of shape. It was constructed, intentionally, delicately, and powered by principles humanity had only scratched the surface of. He came to believe he was staring directly at technology from beyond Earth. Working within the craft was not without pressure. Security surrounded every moment. Lazar was constantly under escort, closely monitored, and reminded again and again just how serious his assignment was. Interaction with his coworkers was minimal. Each individual knew only their specific task, and sharing information beyond it was strictly forbidden. Still, during brief exchanges, Lazar got the sense that others were working on different systems, navigation, structural materials, even biological components. If accurate, the operation was vast, addressing all facets of the craft's origin and design. Element 115 would go on to become the most controversial detail in Lazar's claims. At the time, no known element by that name existed. Skeptics dismissed it instantly as fiction, but in 2003, Scientists succeeded in synthesizing element 115, later naming it moscovium. Though short-lived and unstable, its creation reignited attention toward Lazar's story. He had spoken of it years before, describing a version that was stable, not yet discovered by modern physics. To supporters, it was a validation. To critics, mere coincidence. The fine details Lazar gave, regarding the interior of the craft, became another battleground. Detractors argued that his descriptions fit too neatly into sci-fi stereotypes, more echoes of cultural imagination than of first-hand experience. Supporters countered that the consistency between pop depictions and real witness accounts pointed to a deeper truth, that people had been seeing the same vehicles for decades, and Lazar's story aligned because it was genuine. Regardless of the argument, Lazar's narrative was vivid. He described a machine not driven by power, but by elegance. A small reactor, no bigger than a basketball, powering flight beyond explanation. The interior, he said, was not made for humans, but for others, smaller beings whose needs shaped the craft's size, its curves, and its simplified environment. The system operated by manipulating the structure of space itself, bending gravity rather than fighting it. What stayed with Lazar the most was the emotional weight of entering the craft. He confessed a mix of wonder and fear. It wasn't just the science that disturbed him. It was what it represented. If the vehicles were authentic, then humans weren't alone. If they had been recovered, someone had already visited, and if the government was secretly studying them, then perhaps the greatest truth of the modern age wasn't hidden in deep space, but buried in a corner of the Nevada desert. For Lazar, that moment flipped everything. The hangars had revealed the crafts. Stepping inside revealed the design. The propulsion systems hinted at function. The remaining question was performance. How these principles translated into flight, that answer, he said, would also come. Inside the craft, Lazar stood on the line between understanding and the unknown. A scientist trained in physics now faced a machine that challenged every rule he had learned. An outsider brought into a classified program, tasked with decoding technology that asked questions humanity hadn't dared to answer. It was, he later said, the most extraordinary assignment of his life, and one that would soon cast him into the heart of controversy. After stepping into the Set 4 craft, Bob Lazar's life shifted permanently. The secrecy intensified. Surveillance surrounded everything. And now he carried a burden he hadn't expected. One of truth, but Lazar wasn't wired for silence. His nature, restless, bold, uncomfortable with submission, led him to a decision few in his position would have risked. He decided to reveal what he knew. But the press wasn't his first destination. He began with his inner circle, close friends, people he trusted. He told them the government was flight testing exotic craft in the Nevada desert, machines that defied known science. His friends were unsure, skeptical even, but Lazar was insistent. He told them he could prove it. And so, under the cover of night, he took them into the desert to watch the sky near Groom Lake. The location was hand-picked, remote backroads and elevated ridges that allowed a distant look into restricted airspace. Lazar told them the tests weren't random. He knew the schedule. If they arrived at the right moments, they would see the flights. Photos, binoculars, camcorders, the group came prepared. They parked along empty desert highways, the air cool and still, broken only by occasional breezes or wildlife sounds. Then they waited, sometimes for hours. Stillness, silence, nothing. Then the lights would come. Lazar's friends remembered luminous objects silently rising from the desert, distant at first, like flares or stars, but soon their movement became clear. The lights shot across the sky, hovered still, changed direction without deceleration, then vanished in ways no conventional aircraft ever could. They moved sharply, impossibly, defying everything taught in flight physics. One friend described the glow, constant, not flickering like navigational lights. Another recalled it tilting suddenly, then bolting into the sky without stutter. No sound, no exhaust, just motion. The silence was almost as eerie as the performance. No engine noise, no sonic trail, just light moving through darkness. On one night, someone brought a video camera. The footage was grainy, distant, shaky, but it captured something. Points of light, moving in angular, erratic, non-ballistic patterns. It wasn't proof, but to Lazar, it was validation. Another piece of the puzzle, small but undeniable, to show others these machines were real. Of course it wasn't without consequences. Groom Lake was locked down with constant patrolling. Surveillance on the perimeter was tight. Lazar said that one night they were spotted, pursued by security vehicles. He remembered the headlights behind them, tearing over dirt roads, the fear of capture pressing into every second. Discovery could have ended everything, his clearance, his future, or worse. Still, he returned. The watches continued. It wasn't just about thrill anymore. It was about sharing the burden he carried. By showing his friends the craft in flight, he made witnesses of civilians. They couldn't call it fantasy. They had seen it. These desert outings blurred Lazar's line between secrecy and disclosure. He was still on the payroll, still bound by protocols. But the moment he led people to see what the world wasn't allowed to, he stopped being an employee and started becoming a whistleblower, quietly, off camera, with nothing but a sky full of questions. And yet, Lazar's group wasn't alone. Reports surfaced everywhere from locals, truckers, travelers on lonely roads. They too saw lights over Groom Lake, brilliant disks, darting across starlit skies with no sound at all. Some reports aligned with the very nights Lazar said the tests took place. That overlap added credibility to his claims. Had his friends been the only ones to witness the strange lights, it might have been dismissed as exaggeration or wishful thinking. But with independent sightings emerging from nearby areas, the argument that something unusual was truly happening grew harder to ignore. For Lazar, these nights in the desert marked a turning point. His story moved from private account to collective experience. Now, others carried pieces of what had once belonged only to him. They had their own memories, their own proof, even if captured in grainy, distant images. To Lazar, it confirmed one thing clearly: the truth could not be hidden forever. But trouble followed the revelation. Inside Sephor, suspicion rose. Surveillance was constant. And beyond the gates, Lazar began to feel the growing pressure of being watched. Phones clicked with strange echoes. Unfamiliar vehicles appeared in mirrors. The sense of being monitored never left him. By bringing his friends into the desert, Lazar knew he'd crossed a boundary. He had moved from a cleared contractor to a potential leak, someone the system could no longer trust. Yet still, he stood by what he'd seen. The lights his friends witnessed, the footage they captured, the impossible movements all served to reinforce what Lazar already believed. The crafts were real, they were being tested, and the public deserved the truth. The memory of those desert nights continued to haunt the witnesses who joined him. For them, it wasn't just a strange event, it was a break in reality. As they stood watching the sky over Groom Lake, something snapped. The separation between ordinary life and extraordinary possibility disappeared. The machines they saw operated in a way that no man-made aircraft could. Years later, many of those same friends still remembered what they had seen. They spoke of the thrill, the anxiety, the astonishment they felt while watching glowing discs maneuver through the night. Whether or not they accepted every detail of Lazar's broader story, they couldn't deny the visual truth. The lights had been real. To the wider UFO community, Lazar's desert watches became part of the foundation beneath his credibility. These were independent observers, outsiders with no agenda, who described events that matched his timeline and location. Skeptics called the footage ambiguous, and the testimony anecdotal. Believers saw it differently. They viewed it as the kind of rare, first-hand corroboration that was missing in so many other UFO cases. Those long desert nights carried more than just risk. They became symbolic. They spoke to Lazar's unwillingness to stay quiet, to his need to share the truth, even under threat. This was the moment when secrecy began to leak, when hangars full of mysteries became whispers in the open air. In the silence of the Nevada night, amid windswept roads and glowing skies, something sacred shifted. The discs left trails, not only through the heavens, but through history. They became the link between Lazar's classified knowledge and the coming storm of publicity. His friends, their cameras, the spotlight of pursuing patrols together, they were part of the story that was about to make headlines.